and went in the service after I graduated.
Where did you take ROTC?
I went to school at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, which had a ROTC program. All students, it was a boys' school at the time, all students took 2 years of ROTC, and then those of us that wanted to be commissioned took 4 years of ROTC.
Where were you living at the time that you were commissioned?
My hometown was Utica, New York, and at the time I was actually commissioned, it was at Fort Lee, Virginia, where I had completed the summer camp training for officers.
Why did you decide to join the service?
Well, in those days, again, this is the early 60s, we had a military obligation, young men, and we owed, if I recall this right, if you were classified 1A, which I was, you had about a 6-year obligation, and you had to resolve that in some way. So I felt this was the best way to go in the service, to go in as an officer, and secondly because although my father did not serve, I had uncles that served in the service, and I had a very positive opinion about the military and thought this was a great opportunity.
Do you recall the date you were commissioned?
Yes, I was commissioned on, I believe it was 28 July 1961.
Do you recall your first days in service?
Actually, after I was commissioned, I came home and did not immediately go in, although I had hoped to. I didn't get orders until early January of '62. So I actually went in the service on active duty 5 January 1962, and I was sent to initially to I was in the Transportation Corps at that time and was sent to Fort Eustis, Virginia for a basic introduction or orientation course for transportation officers.
So between July '61 and January '62, you were at home?
I was at home. I worked, and I had I had a job. But I had hoped to go in the service right after that. But for some reason, there was a delay because of whatever.
How long did you spend at Fort Eustis?
I think that was about a 10-week course, including, introduction to the Army, introduction to the Corps, and field exercises, and just a general basic introduction to the military. It went from early January to, I believe, about mid-March.
Is that your introductory training, whereas enlistees that are officers get basic training? Officers don't get basic training?
Well, the summer training is a basic training. I think it was 8 to 10 week course in the summer. Every ROTC officer candidate spends one summer, usually in their junior year, in a basic training type of capacity. It's all physical training. It's weapon training. It's CBR, chemical, radiological, biological warfare. You're introduced to weaponry. You're put on compass courses, and generally it's a very physical, demanding period. That is their basic. Yes.
So you took your basic training
at Fort Lee in the summer of '61.
Was that your junior year?
Actually, it was my senior year. I did not go in my junior year. I was taken sick with a strep throat just after I took my exams in my junior year, and so I had to postpone it till my senior year. That's why I was commissioned right after it. Normally they would not be, right, exactly, because I was already graduated from the university.
Do you remember any of your instructors?
By name?
Name or experience?
I don't remember by name now, but actually I do. I remember there was a first lieutenant at again, now I'm talking about the summer camp, who was a Lieutenant Marlowe. He was a airborne ranger and was the company commander of our company. And we used to have to get up every morning and you know, be in physical exercise for about an hour and a half, and it started at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they would, you know, rudely wake you up, as you can imagine, by banging on a garbage can, and you had, I think it was 5 minutes to ship and shape up, as they say, and get downstairs in formation. And we wore T-shirts and fatigue pants and combat boots. And one particular time I had noticed over the weekend that he had come in late on a Sunday night, and on Monday morning when we ran, he pulled out of the formation and vomited. And so I knew he had a pretty party-like weekend. So as he came back into the beside me, near me, I just said to him, tough weekend, huh, Lieutenant? And with that, he gave me a real dirty look. And so at the end of the formation, after the PT was over, the running, he called me out. And he said, Newman, they call us cadets, Cadet Newman, would you like to run some more? And I said, well, sure. And the guys in the platoon, I said company, it was a platoon, were egging me on a little bit, you know, and I was in great shape, and I had worked out, and I thought I could, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could take this guy, you know? So we began to run. He said, well, we'll run till one of us quits. And I figured, you know, I know he isn't feeling good. I'm younger than he is, and I'm in very good shape now, and best shape of my life. And I said, yeah, you know, and it was a challenge. So we ran and ran and ran along the beach in combat boots in the sand, and finally I was exhausted. I mean, I had a pain in my side. I couldn't do it, so I pulled over and stopped. And of course, he looked like he could run forever. And so when he marched me back to the platoon, and you know, I was you know, kind of crestfallen because I couldn't take this guy. And the guys got a big kick out of it, and he was after me a lot after that. He did hundreds and hundreds of push-ups because he thought I was kind of a wise guy, you know, to do this. So I remember him well. The sergeant was excellent. They were great guys, and I would say both there and in Fort Eustis, the training we got was excellent, and I have a high regard for all our instructors, and some amazing people, I might add, that were in many cases, you know, combat veterans in those days from World War II, Korea, and soon to be Vietnam. And so they were, I would say we got extraordinary training and all the way around. But I remember him specifically because of that incident.
Where did you go from Fort Eustis?
From Fort Eustis, I was originally to go to Fort Mason, California, which I was looking forward with great delight, because this was right in San Francisco, and I had never been west. I'd never been to California. I don't think I had been any farther in Ohio, actually. And here I was going to the West Coast, single, young, you know, 22 years old, and A week before we graduated in March of '62, the orders were changed suddenly, and 6 of us were put on orders for Korea. The other 5 were crestfallen, and I was delighted because I thought, wow, Korea, to get overseas, to get into the Orient, to see the Army in a whole different world, because Fort Mason would have been kind of garrison duty. It certainly would have been heavy military. So that night I remember calling my mother, and she was horrified that I was going to Korea because they could remember Korean from the Korean War, and she talked about that phone call for many years. But I cheered her right up. I said, I'm terribly excited about this. This is a great opportunity for me. And so myself and one other officer who was with me actually John Carroll, who graduated me at John Carroll, were on orders together, and we drove across the country and flew out of I think Travis Air Force Base in I believe it was late March of 1962 for Korea.
You remember arriving in Korea?
I remember the whole trip very well. I mean, it in those days, it was prop planes, and we were crowded into with number of dependents on this, and I remember being pretty geographically dense in those days. And when we took off from Travis, I thought Japan might be. We were first to go to Japan. I thought Japan might be 8 hours away or so. It turned out to be 24 hours away. Actually, the whole trip was 27 hours, and we were. It was a long, tedious trip. We stopped in Hawaii, Wake Island, and ultimately in Yokohama, Japan. Actually, I'm sorry, Tachikawa Air Force Base near Yokohama, and we were awaiting another flight, an Air Force flight to Korea, but for some reason it didn't develop right off, or they didn't have a flight, and so Jim and I, Jim McLaughlin and I, who was with me, we had the delightful experience of spending a week in Japan. And so we were awaiting a flight, and then finally after a week we left and flew into Ascom City, which is south of Seoul.
And what was your job in Korea?
Do you want that to be? I was assigned initially to the transportation, the 17th Transportation. I wonder if this is going to. We came into Ascom City, which is south of Seoul, and I was assigned to the 17th Trans Battalion of the 7th Infantry Division. And when the officer who was giving the briefing just after we arrived pointed on the map to where we were going to be located, I thought he was pointing to North Korea. It was so close. It was right up on the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and I was a little shocked. I might also say that when we were in the States and we got out in California, we stopped at Fort Mason to just see what we were going to miss, and we told the sergeant there that we were going to Korea, both Jim and I, and I'll never forget his remarks. He said, well, he said, good Lord, he said, you'll have to burn all your clothes. It stinks like crazy, and it said, good luck to you. And boy, we were all, after that, we were kind of, shocked. Here we could have been here in Fort Mason in San Francisco. Instead, we were going to this place that he said was awful. So anyway, and as we arrived and as we took a bus north, they put us on a military bus north, it was teeming rain, and it was forlorn, and the people were walking along the roads with mud up to their knees, and I kept thinking, we'll go through the city of Seoul. It's got to be a lot better. When we went through the city of Seoul, it wasn't very much better. Now, the Korean War veterans will tell you, obviously Seoul was destroyed and twice over, I believe. And as we moved north, it got more primitive. And so Jim and I looked at each other and thought, boy, this is going to be a long, tough year. So it was a shock to see the third world for the first time, and the poverty, and it was a desolate place with it's a very mountainous, rugged country, and the people are I came to love the people very much, but it was something I had just never seen before, and it was an eye-opener, and we were in a state of shock. I remember that.
So what did you do for your year in Korea?
In Korea, I was a platoon leader with an armored personnel carrier company, M113. Our job was to move the infantry into position and fight alongside. As I said, we were within a few miles of the North Korean border, and therefore we were always on a high state of alert in the infantry division. We spent a lot of time in the field. I had, we called the armored personnel carriers tracks, so if I refer to it, that's what they are. I had 20 tracks and about 40 men under me.
What was your rank at that time?
I was a second lieutenant. And you had to learn to drive it. Everybody had to learn to drive the vehicle. It was a unique vehicle, and it could move about 40-45 miles an hour. It carried an infantry squad into battle. It protected them from small arms fire. It also would float, and so therefore we had to learn to take it into deep water, which was quite an experience, because when you did that, we came down a hill and went into deep water, and it would go under. Now, when you're in all buttoned up in a vehicle like that going under the water, it would go down maybe 8-10 feet, and then you had to make sure that you put on the bilge pumps, or else it would sink. So you put on the bilge pumps, and you went down, and it went under the water, and you were under the water for a few minutes until it bobbed and came to the surface. So it was the first time around. It was, and we had some casualties along those lines too. So, but you had to drive it, and it was a remarkable vehicle, actually. We also had to be very, very careful. We couldn't go on any paved roads, but again, up that way there weren't any paved roads, so that wasn't a problem. But when you went into the villages, your visibility wasn't terribly good. You had to be very careful of little children and animals, and we didn't think I'd have anything happen to children. We did run over a few dogs and things, but there was the driver was down, and the commander or myself would be up in a cupola on a headset to the driver and onto the net, and it was a very interesting experience. You would go in the riverbeds mostly because you had to stay off the roads, and I found it a very challenging job, and we went out in the field a lot with it. We followed the infantry, or took the infantry position. We went on alerts a lot. The exercises were very demanding. The vehicle also took a lot of maintenance, and it would throw, as they say, throw a track, and you couldn't go because it was like a tank track, and you'd have to stop, and we had the whole Korean experience. To me, was a fabulous opportunity, and it turned out to be everything I hoped it would be, and then some. and I didn't know what to expect, but it was, I want to be emphatic about this, it was one of the great experiences of my life. And I thank the military and the Army particularly for that opportunity. I found that the work that we did with the infantry gave me a great appreciation for the sacrifices that men were making out there, and I just loved the assignment. I was delighted to be in that capacity. I've relished being a platoon leader. I learned so many things. You know, it's hard to say. You know, you were kind of like a father confessor. You were a counselor. You were a judge and a policeman, and kind of a big brother to these 19-year-olds. And hey, I was only 22, and then it was tough too, because you know, I'd never been in charge of a young group of men, and you wanted to be friendly with them, but you still had to command their respect, and you had to make sure that you accomplished the mission first, and then took care of them and their welfare. So I did a lot of instructing, teaching. I was the mess officer also. I was also put on, trained by the Marines, and did an exercise on the west coast of Korea, in the area of Pohang, Korea. We went on an LST for a week and did an amphibious landing and assault on the west coast with several Army units of the 7th Division. And on that LST, we ran into a typhoon. And that was one of the incredible experiences of my life. I'd never been in anything like that. In the typhoon, an LST is a ship that has a bow that's flat, and it drops and allows the tanks and everything to come off. It comes right up to the shore. And because it has a flat bow and because it has a flat bottom, it's very rough in seas. And it...
You were actually on that when in the typhoon?
In the typhoon. It was the tail end of the typhoon. But one night, just to mention this, I had taken one of my squads. I had, I believe, 10 APCs and about 15 men aboard, and I was the embarkation officer. They had trained me to help to learn how to position all the vehicles and the tanks and tie them down, and you know, get ready for, so when we hit the beach we could come out fast, you know. And so when we hit this typhoon, it was in the middle of the night, and it threw me over onto the bulkhead. All of a sudden the ship lurched enormously, and it rolled me under the bulkhead of the wall, and then threw me out. I was up at the top, and I landed on the floor, and I'm like, you know, I was shocked, and I could hear. So I decided to put on my boots and get on my jacket and go out to see what was going on. I was on the main deck, in you know, inside a cabin room, and as I got out there, the wind was howling and the waves were breaking over the ship, and I did something that was actually pretty foolish. There were rope lines, and an LST doesn't have any walls. It's just got rope lines. So I went along the rope line and climbed up to the bridge where the Navy was, and got in there, and it's all lights out, and it was an awesome thing to see, because the waves were breaking over the bow. They were like 30 feet, 40 feet high, and the Navy was, you know, they were very nonchalant. Yeah. And I said to one of them there, I said, you know, boy, what kind of a list did we take on this? And they said, oh, it was about a 30, 35 degree list. And I said, well, what can the ship take? You know, and they said, well, about a 40. I said, boy, it's awful close, isn't it? I mean, you know, and they were, you know, didn't bother them the least. And they said, look, Lieutenant, I think you ought to go back down and you know, be careful on your way down. Well, on the way down, I did, and a wave hit and slammed me to the deck. And thank God I was holding on to the lifeline, because it would have swept me right out to sea. when I got back into the stateroom, I was soaked, and all the other officers in the room with me, I don't know, maybe there was 8 or so, were all up with their life jackets on. I didn't have a life jacket on. And they were, no, it was a terribly, and everybody was sick. I don't get seasick, so I didn't. But the next morning for breakfast, I remember this well, I was the only Army officer that showed up with the Navy. And as I was eating, a bowl of cereal or whatever I was eating, my face flamed red. It was so rough that I can't imagine that, people have told me that, if you've been on a destroyer at sea or a destroyer escort, they call them tin cans because they bob and weave, well, this is a tough thing to be at sea with, and then it cleared and it was fine, but for 1 or 2 nights, I mean, it was an experience.
Where did you go after Korea? You were there for 1 full year?
I was there for 13 months, yes. And after Korea, I was, I actually tried to stay in Korea, but I by that time, I think you had to rotate back for a while. So I came back to the States, was assigned to back to Fort Eustis, Virginia, and assigned to an intelligence unit, which I was delighted with. So I was the 333rd Intelligence Detachment at Fort Eustis. Our job was to survey the ports along the Atlantic seaboard and the Great Lakes to determine, in the case of emergency, how the military could use those facilities. It was a small unit, and we had specialists in all different sergeants, E7s, E8s, E6s, who were specialists in, for example, ports, and specialists in rail, specialists in highway, and the job was for the officer. It was only, in this unit, there was only a captain and myself. I was still a second lieutenant. And we would take a team out, and we would survey the port, meet with the port authorities, meet with the city authorities, meet with the police and fire departments and emergency groups, and learn about the capability of the city. It was a classified report. Well, I believe it was classified confidential. It wasn't secret. And it was a very demanding job, but it was very interesting, and I enjoyed it immensely, and took several teams out. I found that it was that we it was a technical type of thing. I learned a lot about ports and highway systems and bottlenecks and bridge restrictions and weight restrictions. Remember, because you got to be able to bring the tanks in, or the heavy military vehicles, and could they get through these areas? Could they get under the bridges? Could they have the load capacities to do this in case of emergency? So as an aside, I was taken sick one day, and with a collapsed lung suddenly, and sent on an emergency basis to a veterans hospital in outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And to my good luck and fortune, there was a young nurse there that took care of me, and I ultimately married. And she also became an Army nurse. So we spent about 18 months with that unit, and then my 2-year obligation was over, and I volunteered to do what they call go indefinite. I was still a reserve officer. I was not a regular Army officer, so I was a reserve officer. And they're extended indefinite, which means that you can stay in as long as the service wants you. And I volunteered then to go to Europe, and in September, after I was married, in August 1st of this is '64, I was sent to Frankfurt, Germany, as a first lieutenant. Now, by this time, I had been promoted to a first lieutenant on a ship, and had another interesting experience as we arrived in Bremerhaven, Germany. My name was called over the loudspeaker there at the port, to my shock, because I didn't know anybody on the continent of Europe. I was all alone. And when I arrived at to the station master, and they said, Lieutenant Newman, I said, yes. They said, sign for the train. And I couldn't believe it. I said, sign for the train? What train? They said, you are in the command of a train to take about 500 soldiers south to Frankfurt. And you have to ensure that they get off at the right stations. So I said, but do I have to, I can't believe I got to sign for the train. They said, you got to sign for the train. This is routine. So I had to sign for a locomotive, a coal car, 5 passenger cars, and a caboose. And then I said to the sergeant, I said, well, what if this train finds itself in East Germany or something? You know, I mean, I don't know where this train is going. He gave me a lot of comfort. He said, you'll be paying for this for the rest of your life. Well, with that, I reluctantly signed for the train. But now it's a good story, because the train did not go to East Germany. It eventually got to Frankfurt, and I was released from that obligation. I had to sign a hand receipt, if you can believe it. It actually listed the train in the pieces. And I gave it back, and I got there and said, you got your train back, and it's all here. Here this goes again. When, after the train was delivered to the proper authorities, I was assigned there in Frankfurt, Germany, to the 92nd Company, which was a member of 5th Corps. We provided vehicles, jeeps, 3/4 tons to the Corps headquarters, a lot of generals and colonels. It was kind of a high-pressure job. I was promoted in the summer of '65 to captain, and I commanded this unit for most of my time in Germany. It was, again, a terrific experience. I was the judge, jury, commander. We had open door policies on Monday night. I also was involved in, sat on the member of a lot of court martials and the trial counsel and defense counsel. So it, again, was a terrific experience. I had a very good relationship with the men. I had the high regard for all of them. It was a great company, and again, tremendous opportunity to be in Europe to see the U.S. military there. In April of 1966, I received orders to leave Germany and report to Fort Lewis, Washington, en route to Vietnam. Now, I didn't know exactly when the orders first came down that I was going to be on orders to Vietnam, but I had my company commander ahead of me, Jim Radford, had volunteered for Vietnam and gone over as a helicopter pilot, and I had put on my preference sheet that I also would like to volunteer for Vietnam. So whether that was a factor or there was just a demand, the military presence in Vietnam was growing, and so we were. So I was brought back to the States with my family on a military ship, and we drove across the country. By this time, we had a 5-month-old, and we reported, I think, May 1st, 1966, into Fort Lewis, Washington, and the 4th Infantry Division. We formed a new unit called the 8th Group, which was a motor transport unit that had at that time, 1 battalion under it, but in Vietnam it was to bring in 2 more battalions. And in September or early October of 1966, we went by ship en route to Vietnam. I was my assignment was the group maintenance officer at the time, which I was a little disappointed in because I was hoping, since I'd been a company commander in Europe, to get a company, which is the ultimate, that an officer wants in the service. But it was a big job. We had hundreds and hundreds of vehicles, and we had a great officer corps. I was delighted to be with this group, and anyway, we left by ship. It was kind of an amazing experience too, because this troop ship with maybe 1,800 men on it left the San Francisco harbor. We waved leisure boats and yachts and girls water skiing, and here we were going off to war, and there was nobody there to see us off, and it was the contrast was extraordinary. Here everybody was business as usual, and here we were going off to war, and many of the men on that ship probably didn't return. It took us 18 days to cross. It was a small ship, as it goes, and we first came into Da Nang Harbor, and it was an extraordinary experience there because we could see the firefights. We were not allowed to get off the ship initially, but and there were all kind of civilian ships in the harbor waiting to be unloaded, and the Marines were there at Da Nang, but I volunteered to get off the ship with some guards to guard some of our equipment that was and their equipment that was being unloaded, and so I got my first taste of being on the Vietnamese soil and seeing the people in the action, and we were only there for guarding it for maybe 6-8 hours or something. Got back on the ship, and now I had been designated because of my experience in Korea as the embarkation officer, or my responsibility was to load this ship with the Navy, and so when we went down the coast to Quy Nhon, which was, I don't know, maybe 200-300 miles south, we pulled into that harbor. They had these platforms come out, and the LCUs came out and took our guys onto and their equipment or their luggage onto the and I have a picture of this, onto the LCUs. But I had to stay on the ship because I had to make sure all our equipment got off in the order, and so on one occasion one of the dangerous things on a ship, if you've ever been on this, is that you have to go down these Jacob ladders or rope ladders, and when the sea swells are high, our men were on a platform, but that platform left, and so when I had to get off the ship after I got all our equipment off, I had to go down the Jacob's ladder. Well, the Jacob's ladder is just a rope ladder, and if you're in big sea swells, it gets slammed against the ship, and it can be a very dangerous exercise, and you have to jump off of it to the other craft, and the Navy guys are usually trying to help you, and I know some horror stories of guys that were lost because they couldn't, and ships would slam together, and we have one of the members of our post who lost 18 Marines during something like that. But anyway, I got off safely, and when I got to the harbor and to the port, unfortunately, my unit had all left, and this was like a day later or so, and I didn't know where to go. I had all my equipment, I had my rifle, I had all my equipment on, And I said to them, do you know where the 8th group went? And they said, well, they're down the road, you know, somewhere, and it made no sense to me. So I said, well, how am I going to get there? I mean, I had no vehicle, nothing. And they said, well, why don't you jump into one of these trucks? It was a Hashin truck, not a Hashin, well, it was a Korean truck and a Korean driver. And they said, I think he knows where it is, you know. So here I am, I get in the truck. This is my introduction to Vietnam. And we drive along, and I'm looking at this guy, and I can't speak to him, and he looks like he knows, maybe. And but anyway, long story short, he did know, and he drops me off at the 8th group, and we're all in tents and setting up our tents in this valley, about 15, 20 miles inland from the coast. And we then, within a few weeks, another battalion comes in. The 27th Battalion was already in Vietnam. They had come in Vietnam about 1965, and they had with them, or they had in their battalion about 5 truck companies, maybe, yeah, 5 I would say. And they had convoyed the highways called Highway 19. Now, Highway 19 is very famous. In the movie, we were soldiers. The beginning of that movie opens up with a ambush of the French on Highway 19, French Mobile 100, were wiped out on that highway. And it was a very dangerous highway. In the end of Vietnam, it's that area that falls, and the people are out of Pleiku and the Central Highlands are routed, and there's a massacre on this highway in the end in 1975. So the highway extends from the coast all the way to the Cambodian border. It's about 110, 120 miles, and we convoyed that every day. That was our mission, to support the 4th Infantry, which we came with, who were stationed around Pleiku, to the Airborne, I think the 82nd Airborne, and the 25th Division. Eventually these units all came, and our job was to provide transportation. The 1st Cav Division was in An Khe, which was halfway there, and so they could supply themselves somewhat with helicopters and etc. and transports, but we took the heavy stuff, rations, ammunition, fuel, concertina wire, daily. If you can imagine, supplying divisions, you know, it was an enormous job. And I had to make sure initially that, as the maintenance officer, that these vehicles were ready, they were properly prepared, they were maintained, we had enough of them. And I was at the group headquarters. We met every morning with a colonel who was our commander, and we were given our assignments. I talked about the readiness and maintenance of the unit. And then about 4 months into Vietnam, I volunteered to be a company commander, which was, you know, I was most anxious to be a company commander, and an opportunity arose because the battalion commander, who knew me well from Fort Lewis, and I worked under, he was now the battalion commander, and he asked for me, so I became the company commander of the 597th Company, which was a medium truck company, the first American truck company in the Central Highlands. It participated in the first convoy on Highway 19 to Pleiku, and it was the last company to leave of that area, to leave Vietnam in 1972. So this was January, February of 1967 now. I was a captain, of course, and I became the company commander. This was a great challenge, a great assignment, and I was absolutely delighted. Every officer, this is his dream, to command a company in a combat area. The unit, the average age again of a Vietnam veteran in those days was about 19.2 years. So there were 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds. They were driving these huge 5-ton trucks 110 miles across one of the most desolate and beat up roads I had ever seen, with huge potholes, with elephant grass right up to the side of the road, and up two of the most scary passes that I have ever seen, the An Khê Pass and the Mengyang Pass, which were hairpin curves all the way up. The vehicles would slow down to maybe 5 miles an hour, pulling these enormous loads up these passes. The temperature in the cab, I had been in the cabs to share this experience with the men to learn how it was. Normally I was in a gun jeep as I went on these convoys with a .30 caliber behind me, a driver and a gunner, and ultimately we put armor because of the incidents that were happening and the snipers. But the men in these trucks were the heroes, really, of this thing. They were 19 years old. They drove these passes. The temperature in the truck might have been 120 degrees. They wore a flak jacket and a helmet and had their rifles. But if there was an ambush, they had no chance. One time a medical doctor came to see me and said, "You know what you're doing to these young boys?" He said, "You're killing them. You know, they're bleeding from the rectum. You can't work them like this." And I said, "Look, Captain, I know what's going on here, but we are under orders to keep moving this. If we can't get these supplies through, the infantry's in big trouble up there. So we got to do it." And we had some of them very frightened. You know, I got to be careful here now.
I can stop at any time.
Yeah. Okay. They were good troops, all of them, and we convoyed this daily for 7 days a week. The drive was exhausting. When I went, I provided the only security they had. There would be 1 or 2, maybe 3 gun trucks, or gun jeeps, excuse me. And we might have 50, 70 vehicles. We would leave at around 0500 in the morning, travel across temporary bridges because the Viet Cong had blown all the bridges, so the engineers had put Bailey bridges up, and climb the passes to the highlands. Now that's where the highlands are, and they're flat, good tank country, more open. But in the sea coast, and as you went along, the grass was high. There was infantry units at various points, but nobody could really help us because if we were attacked or ambushed, they would hit us and then fade into the elephant grass and disappear. And by the time helicopters got in there, they were gone. It was a nerve-wracking and very dangerous mission, and the 8th Group distinguished itself. We had in the 27th Battalion, after I left now, it got worse actually. In September of '67, all through this time, we were sniped at, and they were putting mines in the roads, and we were being hit. But nothing of any large consequence. I remember an incident of a young lieutenant coming into my company, a good-looking boy, blonde, and for the life of me, I can't remember his name anymore, which is sad. But he he was new, and he was a second lieutenant, and I asked, he wanted to go in convoy, and I said, look, you need a little more time here, Lieutenant, before you take a convoy. So after 3 days, he came back to me and said, look, Captain, I don't think I'm doing anything here. I said, okay, well, there's a convoy going up Highway 1 to Bangsan. Now, it's probably have to stay overnight. If you want to take it, you know, I don't have enough officers to handle this. He said, please, I want to go. I feel I'm useless sitting around here. And so anyway, he took the convoy, and that night, the Viet Cong blew the ammo dump at Bangsan, and he had his arm blown off. I never saw him again, and when I heard about it, I went to the what was it, the hospital there, but it's not an aid station, a field hospital. But he had already been air-evac'd into Japan. We took the serious cases out as soon as they stabilized him and sent him to Japan. But here's a young lieutenant that spent 3 days in Vietnam. We had, you know, I have the highest regard for the soldiers there, and when they went through. The fellows that work with me, it was a privilege, and I took the duty very seriously. They needed me because in the military sometimes I thought on a few occasions that the higher officers above me were the enemy, and you know, there were incidents where they came down on these guys too hard, and without me as their defense, they were in big trouble. And so I did everything possible to defend them, including, you know, getting into some issues with my superiors when I thought, had become way too hard on them. They were just young kids, and they were scared, and they were, and it was a dangerous assignment for them. But we, you know, I remember one occasion where 2 soldiers had been out all night and had nothing to eat, and they were in the mess hall, and so I inspected the company, and they were sitting on their bunks, and I said, did you guys get anything to eat? And they said, no, we got thrown out of the mess hall. I said, what? And they said, yeah, they were having an inspection. Well, you know, I was livid. And so I went back to the mess hall, and sure enough, they were having an inspection. So I threw out the whole battalion staff that was inspecting the mess hall and said, get out of here. These soldiers are going to eat. And so I brought them back to the mess hall, and I stayed there with them. But that's a small incident. But you know, those things happen constantly if you didn't look out for your men. And they came to know that I would always do that for them. But we as the year went on, and I could see that the Viet Cong were getting bolder and bolder. When I first came over there, I thought that perhaps this thing was licked, and we were perhaps going to solve this problem when I was there. But as it got later, I could see that things were becoming very troublesome. And our intelligence reports every morning, we were hearing more and more boldness of the Viet Cong coming into the villages, executing the chief of the village and his family. and becoming bolder and bolder in their attacks on the units in our area. In September of '67, only weeks before I was due to rotate out or go home, and you know you're called a short timer in those days, and you become very superstitious, by the way, enormously super, and the pressure on you because you're always afraid you'll be a casualty in the last few days. We were hit in a convoy, not a convoy that I was in, but we were hit hard, and they killed 9 of our men, wounded us 17, and hit us coming home, coming back from Pleiku about 1920 or 19 or 2000 hours in the evening in an area called No Man's Land, aptly called. This was the first of the beginning of a serious amount of ambushes for this unit, in which we lost 50, 60 men killed in ambushes and hundreds wounded. It got much worse. I left before it actually escalated into the Tet Offensive in January 1968. But I had warned both as a maintenance officer and a company commander that we didn't have enough security, that the roads were getting increasingly dangerous, and that the men, actually what they were supposed to have was somebody riding shotgun, and we never had the manpower to put a shotgun person in the trucks. So when they were ambushed, they never had a chance. And they had to try to drive through the ambush, and you know, most of them didn't make it.
How many of these ambushes were you in before you left?
Well, the main one, I was involved in a couple, but the more serious ones, most of the things that I saw were snipers hitting us and small attacks like that. But we had never seen a whole platoon of Viet Cong do this. This was a very bold, and apparently what we found out later was they were under orders to disrupt our movement and resupply those infantry divisions, because if they could have done that, they would have left those divisions without an enormous amount of equipment, and it would have been a big coup for the Viet Cong and the NVA. Subsequently, it got much worse, and but the soldiers persisted. They were heroic in many ways. We had a Medal of Honor winner who, after I left now, who we had to provide our own security. One of the most, you know, GIs are great innovators, and one of the great things about American soldier is they, as opposed to many foreign soldiers, is that they improvise. And so we took on our own security. I had mentioned that we had put armored plate on our trucks. That wasn't authorized. The soldiers found armored plate and put doors on my Jeep for me, and put a front plate of armor, and then behind me was a plate of armor, and so the small arms would normally bounce off. If you got hit with an RPG, you were done for. And in that ambush of 2 September '67, which I have a picture on my wall of one of the vehicles, they killed the people in the gun jeep with an RPG, and then which is a rocket-propelled grenade. One of the great innovations, and as we took, the soldiers decided, one of the warrant officers came up with this idea that we would make some of our 5-ton vehicles into gun trucks. And they heavily armed those gun trucks to protect the soldiers and protect those convoys. Nobody could get to us out there. We were too far out. If we were attacked, the Viet Cong and the NVA knew that we were extremely vulnerable. So we welded all kinds of armor plate on the gun trucks. We put sandbags on them. We put 50 calibers on them. Now we had to scrounge all this stuff because it wasn't authorized. We even put, if there were destroyed armored personnel carriers, they welded the armored personnel carrier top onto the trucks. So it was an incredible thing. And there's been articles written in Vietnam Magazine and in several other magazines about this unit and what they did. And they saved probably hundreds of lives by providing their own security. And at the museum, the Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia, is the only gun truck that survived, called Eve of Destruction. And the men would paint on the side of these gun trucks a name. And this one, we had, in the 597th, we had several. But, and they would go along the convoy. And now you did have communications, so all the gun trucks and the gun jeeps had communications. So they would say, they would call in the clear, contact, contact. And with that, the gun truck and the gun jeeps would rally to the point of ambush and take on the Viet Cong with tremendous firepower from these 50 calibers, sometimes quad 50s, the 30 calibers, and we neutralized, believe it or not, we neutralized their ambush. We killed many Viet Cong, but one soldier again, I was gone by this time, in 1971, in an ambush, he was a gunner in the back of the truck, and one of the Viet Cong threw a grenade into the truck, and he threw his body on the grenade and saved all his comrades. His name was Specialist Dahl, and he was from Portland, Oregon. We had Silver Star winners. We had a lot of heroics, and we had another gun truck from not my unit, but from another unit, also won the Medal of Honor in Vietnam for gun truck. So it was a remarkable unit.
Bill, I saw medals on your wall. Can you tell me about some of the medals that you got and what you got them for?
Yeah, basically, my medals were for command and for being a company commander of a combat unit, the commendation ribbons, and then just the campaign ribbons. Our unit was designated also as a commendation unit by the Army. The Vietnamese government also awarded us the Cross of Gallantry, the unit Cross of Gallantry. So the unit was well recognized. My role in it was, I don't think in any way outstanding. I mean, I did my job. I think I did it well. I protected my soldiers as best I could during that tough times. And I might say this too. I have been a member of the Vietnam Veterans of America for 20 years, a member of the VFW, and I'm very proud of my service in Vietnam. I am also have a different opinion than a lot of people do. My great regret is not in any way, shape, or form that I went to Vietnam. My great regret is that I couldn't do more. I wish we would have stayed and saw that through. I wish we would have freed those people. And I remember clearly, as do many veterans, when Vietnam fell in 1975, it was one of the worst days of my life, because I remember all those soldiers, 58,000, who gave their lives, and we walked away, and we could have taken them. It was the Congress of the United States and the anti-war groups that politically turned the people against us, and the universities that rioted. Those people are still not free, and they went through a terrible ordeal. I hope someday that Vietnam is a free country.
How did you stay in touch with your family when you were in Vietnam?
My wife was great. She wrote letters almost daily, and I wrote whenever I could. I especially wrote her, you know, the night before I went on a convoy, because I felt one of them might be my last letter, and but she was tremendous, and I did meet her in Hawaii, which was an incredible experience. Midway through my tour, we were allowed to, I think, 4 days, and you know, I had a son that was, when I left, was 5 months old. I had another baby born when I was in Vietnam, and so we had 4 beautiful days in Hawaii, but it was terribly tough to leave and go back to a combat zone. And I worry about the soldiers today that come home from Iraq and then have to go back. It's terribly tough on the families, and although it has a great purpose, I remember you know, the pain and suffering too about that. But you know, I made it through. I wasn't wounded. I thank God for that. Most of us came home. Unfortunately, the boys that were in our initial unit, that were in that ambush, didn't make it, and they're all on the wall. I've been down to the wall a couple of times, which is a very emotional experience.
Was there anything special that you did for good luck?
For good luck? I don't know if good luck is the issue, but I sure prayed a lot. No, it was you know, it's one of my, I think, great experiences of my life, and the Vietnam veterans have been a group ever since the wall was built in '82. You know, when we came home, it was a very tough homecoming, and in 1967, the anti-war movement was very active. We were all labeled as baby killers, and I had an incident when I got home at the airport in San Francisco, where I was assaulted, you know. So, and most of us downplayed our service for a long time, because in many cases people didn't want to know, and in many cases people who also were hostile towards us. The media and Hollywood has painted us as, if not baby killers, dangerous. And of all veterans, of all wars, I do believe the Vietnam veterans were persecuted the most. And that has changed today, thank God. But there's a lot of bad feelings still with a lot of veterans because of how they were treated and the lack of support. So we'll never do that again, I'm sure, in this country, but we were torn apart. Some people think that period was the Second Civil War. And there is still, even today, with Senator Kennedy, or Senator Kerry running for president, a lot of reliving and that Vietnam era, and a lot of controversy over some of the things he has said about us before the Congress.
Do you recall your last days in Vietnam?
Vividly.
Can you describe what your last couple days were like?
I was torn, anxious to go home on the one hand, but you know, I felt bad about leaving my comrades. I was an experienced officer. I was, you know, in a company, you're called the old man. I was 28 years old by this time, and I was the old man. And, you know, I felt they needed me, and they were sorry to see me go, and I was, you know, worried about them all the time after I left, because you knew they were in enormous danger. The last day in Vietnam.
Do you remember the date?
Yeah, it's yes. I left Vietnam on about the 19th of September of '67. That's the official date. That I may have left a few days before that. The exact date, perhaps the exact date is around the 16th. One of the unique experiences in leaving was that as I was, I got curtailed by a few days, and so the last few days were very hectic, and you have to pack your whole baggage and say your goodbyes, and you know, it came down fast, and it always comes faster than you think, and I wasn't ready for all that, and you know, it's a very emotional time, and like as I said, you know, you have very mixed emotions. Anxious to see your family, to see my boys, one of which was, you know, 7 months old now, I had never seen. So I was anxious to go home, of course, but at the same time, the things were getting tougher, and I was very worried about our unit. But anyway, I left and said goodbyes, and flew out of the Quy Nhon and down to Cam Ranh Bay, and Cam Ranh Bay is a big military establishment on the coast, and as I was staying there, in one of my very last days, surprisingly, as I was in the mess hall, leaving, coming in the front door was my first sergeant from Germany. Now, he was a remarkable Samuel Anderson, and I thought the world of him, and this was his third war. It's hard to believe today that somebody could go through 3 wars, and their family could go through 3 wars. But this was his third war, and he was very nervous. He was probably in his late 40s, maybe, and he had some young children. He had a German wife, and we sat down and had coffee together, and he said, "Captain, you know, what do you think?" You know, I said, and I try to be optimistic as I could. I said, I think Top, we call a First Sergeant Top. I said, Top, I think you'll be fine. I said, you know, I think this thing is under control. I said, do you know where you're going? He said, no, I haven't had my assignment yet. And but he was nervous. This was his, you know, he was within a couple of years of retiring probably from the service, and this was his third war, and I had a lot of empathy for him. And I looked on the wall, and I didn't see his name, so I assumed that he survived, but he came into a terrible time. And, you know, you often wonder what happened to him. And one of the unfortunate things about this service is we lose contact with so many men that we served with. So I don't know where he went, and I don't know what he went through, but the Tet Offensive hit within months, and it was a very dangerous time. I then remember getting on a plane It was a commercial flight. I think it was a Pan Am flight, and we had American stewardesses, which were, I hadn't seen an American woman in a year, and it was, these stewardesses were cute, and it was kind of a surreal, the whole thing. And I remember sitting down, and I remember, kind of thinking, is this real, because, as they say, you're going back to the world, and when you leave a combat zone, you're until the plane actually lands in the United States, you're not sure you're coming home. I sat down. I remember next to a young man who was staring out the window, and I couldn't get him to talk, and I knew he was, if not frightened, disoriented. And finally, after a while, he wouldn't eat when they came around gave us a tray and everything, and he was only a private or something, it was a PFC maybe. And finally, I got him to talk, and I tried to look out for him because I knew he was in trouble here, or something was wrong. And finally, he told me that he had just, left point. He had just walked point. Now, if you can imagine, this poor young guy had just come out of the jungles, walking point, the first man in a unit walking along the trails in a combat situation, the most dangerous position probably in Vietnam. And he could not understand yet. He had not made the transition where he was going, and he was just so confused. And he never did quite come around. And you worry about those guys, because one of the toughest things with Vietnam is you came home alone. You didn't come home with your unit. The Army has resolved never to do that again, I might add. So when you landed in the States, and most of us kissed the ground, you were alone. Normally there was no family there, unless you happen to have your family on the West Coast or something. And you had to fare for yourself. I remember that vividly. And then, of course, when I got in the States, I called my wife, and she was still in Wisconsin, and I was in California. So I really wasn't home. I didn't even think about that before. So I took a flight, and this is where I had an incident where this hippie type, as I was walking through the airport in uniform, carrying my duffel bag, and he came up to me and started calling me names, and I ignored him, but then he grabbed me, and with that, nobody was going to grab me, and I hit him and knocked him down, and he started yelling, and the security came, and an officer came, and he looked at me and looked at him, and he said, Captain, he said, you just coming home from Vietnam? I said, yeah. He said, why don't you just catch your plane and go home? He said, you don't want to stay around here. And he said, I'll take out the trash. So anyway, we got on, I got, then flew into Chicago, and but this time I was kind of frantic, and so then I found out I couldn't get a flight up to Green Bay, where she was nearby, and so I got a rental car, a Hertz rental car, and drove up, because I had to get home, and it was a rainy night, I forget, and I got lost, and I remember pulling over the side of the road, exhausted and frantic, and trying to calm myself down and trying to orientate myself. Where are you now? Just calm down. You can find this place. And I only had been there a couple times, and it was way out in the country. But I did. I calmed down, and I found it, and got home about 4:30 in the morning or something like that. And it's an adjustment. You think it's all wonderful, and it is, but I mean, you go through a lot of adjustments to and so I was 28 and educated and had been in the military 6 years, so I knew my way around. And even for me, it was, and I didn't anticipate that. It took time for me to get used to being with my family again a little bit, and I was quiet and standoffish, but we came around, and within a couple of weeks or so, and again, I didn't have any. I can imagine these poor young guys that had been wounded or been through a real traumatic experience and what they went through.
Did you go to work or back to school?
I needed to get a job. No, I didn't go back to school. I went to work. I was looking for a job, and I spent the next 2 months trying to find a job, and I had never held a civilian job. I had gone right from college, except for a few months where I worked summers and in a brewery as just a laborer. I had never held a job, so I spent the next 2 months looking for a job.
What did you do as a career after the war?
I got into I joined a bank in my hometown and got involved in the investment business and spent the next 36 years as a investment officer with banks, insurance companies, brokerage firms, and now I have my own business here in Avon in the investment management business.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Yes, I mentioned briefly that I had joined the Vietnam Veterans of America back about 20 years ago, and actually probably closer to 15 years ago, because it was after they had built the wall. And one of my friends from the service and a Vietnam veteran had told me about it, so I joined in and participated into a couple of their meetings, including one in Buffalo, New York, where I worked at the time, and a dedication of a memorial there. I then also joined the Veterans of Foreign Wars and have been a member about 10 years. And when I moved to Avon several years ago, I joined Post 3272 here in Avon, which is a great post. And we have about 25 Vietnam veterans in the post. We have about 22 Korean War veterans. And we have the rest are World War II. And we now are getting in a couple of the Iraq veterans, which we're delighted to have, I might add.
And I understand that you have a job in the VFW in Avon. What is it that you do for the VFW post?
I write a monthly newsletter for the post, which I've been writing for about the last 4 years. We cover all the activities in the post. We have a speaker every month, so I always give the biography of the speaker and what the subject was. It's usually a military subject. One of the things I love that I've done is I have encouraged all the World War II members and all members to write their biographies, and so this is a great project. And many have responded, and I've been thanked by wives and daughters and sons in many occasions for doing this, and gave them a forum and encouraged them many times to tell this story, because these are treasures, and they are leaving us at a rate of about 1,000 or 1,500 a day, and particularly World War II guys. And I write in the letter also, any new member, I give his military background, I do a brief biography on him, and then frequently I write about a military subject, a battle like a Battle of Midway, or if somebody has an interesting experience, I will write up what they give me. I'm going to do one in the next couple of months from one of our veterans who, in fact, just yesterday gave me his I requested this right up for the 60th anniversary of Normandy, and he was in Normandy, and he participated in, he went in on D-Day, and so that'll be fun. It'll be great, and he's a great guy, and he was with the combat engineers in Normandy.
Do you attend any reunions?
No, I have not. I unfortunately, our unit has not had a reunion that I know of. I would certainly go, but at least I have not been told about it, and I'm only beginning now to military. Is it military.com has a website now, in which they're encouraging veterans to make contact with their units, and so I have put my name in, and we now have from the 8th group about 20 veterans, I think, who have signed in. So there's another unit too. I'm sorry, I mentioned it. I also belong to the Transportation Veterans of Vietnam, a new group that I joined a couple of years ago. These are all veterans who served in transportation units throughout Vietnam. Most of them are from the truck units, and they have done an interesting work, and they're doing a lot of interesting work. One of their members has written one very interesting book on gun trucks, and this is a topic I'm very interested in because it's a little known fact of what we did with these American soldiers did with these gun trucks. And he has pictures of hundreds of these gun trucks and the crews, and so this is an organization that I would like to see do well, and is a new unit. So those are the activities so far that I have been involved in.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about military in general?
Absolutely.
How?
First of all, I'm extremely pro-military, and will always be. As I said earlier, it was a great privilege serving my country, especially during wartime. I think today that our young people need to know more about our veterans and their sacrifices, and although we have a new all-volunteer force today, which I'm obviously, as most Americans, very proud of, we need more people to go into the service. It's a great opportunity. It can be dangerous, of course, but it's a great opportunity, and I wouldn't trade one single day of my experience for anything or for any money, for that matter. It was a positive experience in every way. I lament the fact that in many of our high schools, and the pages that they have in their history books on World War II and Korea and Vietnam are very, very limited, and if they are talked about, they are usually very controversial, in many cases anti-American. We have a long ways to go to bring our youth around to understanding that you have to fight for your country at times, and that there's a lot of bad guys out there that would like to see this country damaged or destroyed.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
No, I think I've covered a lot. I would only say that, again, that I believe a patriot. Just because I served in war and in the service does not make me a patriot. And I resent sometimes when I hear that because you served, you're a patriot. You're a patriot and a lover of your country if you continue to do in your life those things that encourage others that support veterans, some more support even the commander-in-chief, and are strong on defense and national security. I believe that way too divided as a country today, polarized over the wars and particularly over Vietnam. I believe that we need to come together. I think we're in a war now that is very serious. It's probably the greatest threat to our security since World War II, and we need to support our soldiers and our war effort and our commander-in-chief. I am dismayed by the comments that are made today in the media and by members of Congress that will encourage the enemy, give them aid and comfort, and probably take American lives, just like the Tet Offensive did during the Vietnam War in 1960. And we're in Jane Fonda and encouraged the enemy because they thought they could influence our elections and our commitment.
Well, Bill, I'd like to thank you for sharing your recollections.
I appreciate the time you gave me.
This is the library at the home of Bill Newman in Avon, Connecticut. This is a wall with his medals and pictures. This is a little model of a gun truck
But eighth group gun truck.
from the 8th group that